The Battle of Rorke's Drift in 1879 remains one of the most astonishing examples of endurance, discipline, and raw courage in military history. On that January day in colonial South Africa, a tiny outpost became the stage for a clash so dramatic that it has echoed through time, etched into both British and Zulu memory. To understand what unfolded at Rorke's Drift, one must first picture the broader context of the Anglo-Zouloue War, a conflict that erupted from imperial ambition and the determination of the Zulu kingdom to preserve its sovereignty and traditions in the face of encroaching European domination. The Zulu Empire, under King Cetshwayo, was formidable. It was a militarized society forged through decades of expansion, disciplined under the legacy of Shaka Zulu, and still fiercely proud in the late 19th century. When the British decided to extend their authority into Zululand, they underestimated the skill, organization, and sheer determination of the Zulu warriors. At the war's opening, the British suffered a catastrophic defeat at the Battle of Isandlwana on January 22, 1879, where over 1,000 imperial troops were wiped out in a shocking humiliation. It was in the immediate aftermath of that disaster that Rorke's Drift occurred, a smaller fight by scale, yet one that would become legendary. Rorke's Drift itself was a mission station, originally established by a Swedish missionary, later repurposed into a supply depot and hospital by the British. It lay near the Buffalo River, which marked the border between British-controlled Natal and the Zulu Kingdom. On January 22, after the massacre at Isandlwana, a Zulu impi of some 4,000 warriors advanced toward Rorke's Drift, determined to destroy the outpost and continue their momentum into Natal. Inside the station were just 139 defenders, composed mostly of British soldiers from the 24th Regiment of Foot, along with a few colonial troops, hospital staff, and others. Facing odds of nearly 30-1, their situation appeared hopeless. The defenders were under the command of two relatively junior officers, Lieutenant John Chard of the Royal Engineers and Lieutenant Gonville Bromhead of the 24th Regiment. Neither man was especially distinguished before that day. Chard had been overseeing pontoon work at the river crossing, while Bromhead was noted as brave but somewhat unremarkable. Yet history has a way of thrusting ordinary men into extraordinary circumstances. The decision they faced was stark: attempt a retreat with the wounded and supplies, or stand and fight. Given the speed of the advancing Zulus and the lack of viable escape routes, they resolved to fortify the station and prepare for defense. The station's structures included a stone hospital and a storehouse, with some open ground between them. The men quickly constructed improvised barricades using mealie bags, biscuit boxes, and wagons to form a perimeter. Inside the hospital lay dozens of wounded soldiers, many barely able to move, whose fates would rest on the courage of their comrades. The defenders understood the enormity of what was coming. They had heard the horror stories of Isandlwana earlier that very day, where their brothers in arms had been annihilated. Now, as dust clouds rose in the distance and the Zulu impi approached with their distinctive battle formations, the British knew they were next. The Zulu warriors were organized in the classic, Horns of the Buffalo, formation, designed to envelop and crush their enemy. Armed with spears, shields, and some captured firearms, they were fierce fighters with absolute confidence in their numerical advantage. As they advanced toward the little outpost, the air grew thick with anticipation. When the first wave of Zulus surged forward in the late afternoon, the defenders opened fire with disciplined volleys from their Martini Henry rifles. The crash of gunfire echoed across the hills, tearing into the ranks of the attackers. Each rifle was powerful, with a range far greater than the Zulu spears, but the attack's momentum was relentless. Wave after wave of Zulu warriors threw themselves at the barricades. The defenders maintained tight firing discipline, shooting in turn to maximize the rate of fire. Smoke filled the air, screams echoed, and the ground outside the perimeter became littered with bodies. Yet the Zulus pressed closer, some reaching the walls, climbing, and thrusting their assegais over the barricades. Hand-to-hand fighting broke out repeatedly. Soldiers used bayonets, rifle butts, and sheer desperation to push the enemy back. The barricades of mealie bags became both shield and grave as the fighting dragged into the evening. In the hospital, the situation grew even more desperate. Zulu warriors set fire to the thatched roof, and flames and smoke engulfed the interior. Wounded men, unable to walk, had to be dragged or carried through the choking air, sometimes under direct assault as Zulus broke through windows and doors. Stories of individual heroism abounded. Privates John Williams and Henry Hook, for example, hacked holes through partition walls to evacuate patients while holding off attackers with bayonets. Several men died in those rooms, refusing to leave until the last of the wounded were saved. Others perished in the flames. The hospital, eventually consumed by fire, stood as a blazing symbol of the ferocity of the struggle. Outside, the fight continued without pause. As night fell, the battle took on a surreal, nightmarish quality. The moonlight illuminated waves of Zulu warriors circling the perimeter, their war cries piercing the night as rifle fire crackled from the defenders. Ammunition ran low, but careful rationing allowed the British to keep firing just enough to repel attacks. The Zulus, though courageous and relentless, had little in the way of siege equipment or heavy weapons to breach the makeshift defenses, and each assault cost them dearly. Still, they tried again and again, unwilling to yield in the face of so small a garrison. Through the long hours of darkness, the defenders fought with grim determination. Many were exhausted, their shoulders bruised from constant recoil, their throats dry from powder smoke and fear, yet they knew that to falter even for a moment meant death. The wounded who had been evacuated from the hospital lay behind the barricades, some continuing to load rifles for their comrades or offer encouragement. The younger soldiers, who had never before seen such combat, aged years in a single night. Bromhead moved among his men, urging them on, while Chard directed the overall defense with calm precision. Both officers would later be hailed as unlikely heroes, thrust into greatness by the sheer necessity of survival. As dawn approached, the assaults finally began to wane. The Zulus, exhausted and demoralized after sustaining heavy casualties, gradually withdrew. The defenders, too, were near collapse. They had fought for nearly 12 hours, from late afternoon until morning, in continuous battle against overwhelming odds. When the sun rose, the men at Rorke's Drift saw the surrounding fields littered with bodies, evidence of the ferocity of their struggle. Estimates suggest that as many as 500 Zulus lay dead, with many more wounded, compared to the defenders' 17 dead and 10 wounded. The victory at Rorke's Drift was shocking in its scale. A mere 139 defenders had repelled an army of thousands. It was the polar opposite of Isandlwana's disaster, occurring on the very same day, and thus became a powerful narrative for the British Empire. In London, newspapers hailed it as a heroic triumph, a redemption for the earlier humiliation. 11 Victoria Crosses, Britain's highest military honor, were awarded to the defenders, the most ever given for a single engagement. The battle entered British military lore as an example of discipline and courage overcoming overwhelming odds. Yet the story is not complete without considering the Zulu perspective. For the warriors who attacked Rorke's Drift, the battle was part of a broader campaign, one in which they had already achieved a stunning victory at Isandlwana. At Rorke's Drift, they faced not only the courage of the defenders but also the harsh realities of modern firearms against traditional weapons. Their bravery was unquestionable, their losses grievous. In Zulu oral tradition, the battle was remembered not as a humiliating defeat but as part of the ebb and flow of a war that had begun with such promise. The warriors had fought with honor, though the imbalance of firepower and fortifications ultimately proved insurmountable. The legacy of Rorke's Drift has been debated for generations. Some view it as a glorious stand, a testament to military discipline, and an inspiring tale of bravery. Others argue that it must be understood within the broader context of imperial aggression, where soldiers defending their post were simultaneously part of a larger system that sought to subjugate the Zulu kingdom. The battle became immortalized in art, literature, and film, most famously in the 1964 movie, Zulu, which, though dramatized, brought the story to a global audience and further cemented it in popular imagination. For the men who fought there, however, it was no legend but a harrowing night of survival. Survivors described the horror of fighting in close quarters, the smell of blood and smoke, the cries of the dying, and the haunting realization that they had survived when so many others had not. Some struggled with the memory for years, while others embraced the honors bestowed upon them. For the Zulu warriors, their courage was remembered in their communities, even as the war would ultimately lead to the dismantling of their kingdom by the British. The Battle of Rorke's Drift was not the largest, nor the most strategically decisive engagement of the Anglo-Zulu War, but it became the most famous because of the sheer improbability of the outcome. It embodied themes that resonate across history: the struggle of the few against the many, the endurance of human spirit under unimaginable pressure, and the fine line between disaster and glory. It remains a subject of fascination for historians, soldiers, and storytellers alike, a reminder of the extremes to which human beings can go in moments of crisis. When reflecting on Rorke's drift today, one must see it both as a remarkable story of survival and as a moment within the larger, often tragic tapestry of colonial wars. It is a reminder that courage can exist on all sides of a conflict, that those who fought with assegai or rifle were all human beings caught in the tide of history. The defenders' stand that night in January 1879 has become immortal, but the Zulu warriors who fought with equal ferocity and paid with their lives also deserve remembrance. The battlefield itself, now a historic site, stands as a silent witness to one of the most extraordinary clashes of the 19th century, a place where history, legend, and memory converge. The Battle of Rorke's Drift cannot be understood without the backdrop of the Anglo-Zouloue War, which broke out in January 1879. The British Empire, seeking to consolidate control over southern Africa, delivered an ultimatum to King Cetshwayo of the Zulu Kingdom, demanding disarmament and acceptance of British authority. The Zulus, proud of their sovereignty and unwilling to submit, refused. The Zulu military system, developed under Shaka and maintained by Cetshwayo, was a fearsome machine of disciplined regiments, bound by loyalty, courage, and strict tradition. On January 22, 1879, the Zulus proved their might by annihilating a British column at Isandlwana, killing over 1,300 men in one of the worst defeats ever suffered by imperial forces at the hands of a native army. Just hours after that disaster, the Zulus moved toward Rorke's Drift, unaware that they were about to encounter one of history's most extraordinary defensive stands. Rorke's Drift was originally a Swedish missionary outpost situated near the Buffalo River, which marked the border between British-controlled Natal and Zululand. By 1879, it had been converted by the British into a supply depot and hospital to support military operations in the region. The station contained a stone-walled hospital, a storehouse filled with provisions, and several smaller buildings, with open ground in between. It was never designed as a fortress and had no real defensive structures. When news of the disaster at Isandlwana reached the outpost, the tiny garrison realized they were next in line for attack. Inside were only 139 able-bodied defenders, along with dozens of sick and wounded men. The site's isolation made escape almost impossible, and abandoning the injured was unthinkable. Instead, the defenders braced themselves for a siege, reinforcing the station with makeshift barricades of mealie bags, biscuit boxes, and overturned wagons. The Zulu army that advanced on Rorke's Drift numbered around 4,000 warriors, part of the impi that had earlier fought at Isandlwana. They were organized in regiments, disciplined and experienced in battle, using tactics perfected over decades. Their favored approach, known as the horns of the buffalo, aimed to encircle and overwhelm opponents, with the chest engaging directly, the horns surrounding, and the loins held in reserve. Most carried traditional assegais, short stabbing spears, alongside large cowhide shields, but some were armed with firearms captured from earlier clashes. Despite their courage and ferocity, the Zulus faced a daunting challenge against defenders armed with Martini-Henry rifles, which had far superior range and firepower. As the warriors surged toward the mission station, their war cries filled the air. The British defenders, though heavily outnumbered, prepared to meet the onslaught with disciplined volleys from behind their hastily built barricades. The defense of Rorke's Drift fell to two relatively junior officers who had little previous opportunity for distinction: Lieutenant John Chard of the Royal Engineers and Lieutenant Gonville Bromhead of the 24th Regiment of Foot. Chard had been at the outpost to supervise engineering work, while Bromhead commanded the infantry detachment. Neither was considered exceptional at the time. Chard was quiet and methodical, Bromhead known for bravery but also for a certain casualness. Yet in crisis, they rose to the occasion. Together, they made the critical decision not to attempt escape but instead to fortify the mission and prepare for defense. Their leadership would prove vital during the long night of combat. Chard maintained overall control, calmly directing the construction of barricades and coordinating the defense. Bromhead inspired his men by fighting alongside them, urging them forward in moments when fatigue and fear threatened to overwhelm. The attack began in the late afternoon of January 22, just hours after the disaster at Isandlwana. The Zulus launched wave after wave against the defenders' barricades. The British soldiers fired with precision, delivering volleys from their Martini-Henry rifles that tore into the attacking ranks. Smoke, screams, and chaos filled the air as the Zulus closed in, some reaching the barricades and engaging in brutal hand-to-hand combat with spears and clubs. Inside the hospital, chaos turned to desperation when the thatched roof was set alight. Wounded men, unable to walk, had to be carried or dragged through rooms as Zulu warriors broke in. Soldiers hacked through walls to rescue their comrades, fighting bayonet to assegai as flames engulfed the building. Outside, the defenders continued firing through the night under the moonlight, repelling charge after charge. For 12 relentless hours, the garrison fought against overwhelming odds, refusing to yield. By dawn, the battlefield around Rorke's Drift was a grim sight. The Zulus, having launched countless attacks throughout the night, had suffered devastating losses. Around 500 warriors lay dead, with hundreds more wounded, their courage and determination undone by the defenders, firepower and fortified position. The British, though victorious, also paid a price. 17 defenders were killed, and another 10 wounded, many gravely. The hospital, burned to ruins, left survivors with horrific memories of smoke, screams, and close combat in confined spaces. The comparison of losses underscored the imbalance between traditional weapons and modern firearms, as well as the determination of the British soldiers to fight for their survival. Despite the heavy toll, the victory at Rorke's Drift stood in stark contrast to the disaster at Isandlwana. It was a rare moment where the outnumbered few had managed to withstand the many, and it shocked observers on both sides. Against all odds, the defenders of Rorke's Drift emerged victorious. Their success was hailed in Britain as an act of supreme courage and discipline, particularly given the humiliation of Isandlwana earlier the same day. The tiny garrison had stood firm against thousands of warriors and prevailed. The defense became an immediate symbol of military endurance, inspiring both the public and soldiers alike. The British press seized on the story as proof of imperial valor, turning the battle into a redemption narrative that balanced the sting of defeat. 11 Victoria Crosses, Britain's highest military honor, were awarded to participants in the defense, the most ever given for a single engagement. While not strategically decisive, the psychological impact was enormous. Rorke's Drift became a legend, representing the ideal of the steadfast soldier holding ground no matter the odds, and it has continued to inspire admiration for over a century. The legacy of Rorke's Drift is complex and enduring. In British history, it is remembered as one of the most heroic last stands, immortalized in books, paintings, and the 1964 film Zoulous. For the soldiers who fought there, it was a night of unimaginable terror, survival, and sacrifice. Some embraced the honors, while others were haunted by the experience. In Zulu memory, it was seen as part of a greater campaign, one that began with a stunning victory at Isandlwana. The battle highlighted both the bravery of the Zulu warriors and the harsh reality of modern firearms against traditional arms. Today, historians view Rorke's Drift as both an incredible feat of endurance and as a reminder of the broader context of colonial conquest, where courage existed on both sides but the consequences of empire brought tragedy. The battlefield now stands as a site of remembrance and reflection.